Thatcherism is back and it's winning.
This is the great Iron Lady, the woman who saved Britain for conservatism, except that she didn't. It's all a great wobbling blancmange of myth. None of it is true.
And I think one of the problems for the right is that she is still haunting you. You will not let her go, and you need to let her go.
What is a conservative?
The preservation of the good and the trusted, the opposition to unnecessary and foolish change, fundamental principles of conservatism, which she did in no case follow.
She was a radical. She radically changed Britain for the better. And quite frankly, I wish we had a politician with the convictions she had in 2025.
Think about all the prime ministers who've been alive during the time that you've been alive. Think of all the prime ministers since Winston Churchill. If there was one of them, just one, that you could have running Britain now and dealing with her challenges, who would you choose?
It was 100 years ago on the day that Margaret Hilda Roberts, as she was born in Grantham, Lincolnshire. She would have been 100 years old today, and her legacy remains as contested and as divisive as it ever was. We know that she was the longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century, the first female Prime Minister, and you go to somewhere like the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, as I was a couple of weeks ago, and they have there encased her clothing, almost like a medieval pilgrimage, that almost by touching it, you might touch her sainthood. She is present still today, so we thought, let's settle the question. Was she the trailblazer, the hero who turned Britain around? It was struggling, and her handbag-wielding, tank-climbing, union-busting energy was what was necessary? Or was she someone who set in motion all of those years ago the seeds of the disquiet and trouble that we are now experiencing today? Well, let's find out. Very sadly, Tim Montgomery, who was going to lead the case for the proposition, has been waylaid and it will not be attending this evening. However, such is the advantage of us now being in a small, happy family with other publications, including The Spectator, that I placed a call to His Lordship Michael Gove, the longest-serving cabinet minister of the last 100 years. He is currently hot-footing it on the tube to come and replace Tim Montgomery tonight, which I think is incredibly sporting of him. But I see that Lord Gove is present in the wing. So first of all, to propose the motion, we have the IEA writer and commentator Reem Ibrahim and former cabinet minister, now editor of The Spectator, Michael Gove. Thank you. Just to oppose the motion, we have one of the most famous writers and talkers we have, the person for whom there is no opinion too awkward, Peter Hitchens, and joining him, someone who has had an incredible journey in her career, from Marxism Today all the way to the Daily Telegraph. It's Suzanne Moore.
Hi. Thank you. Here?
Yeah.
Hi.
So, to open the debate, I have the honor of inviting to the stage Reem Ibrahim.
Hello. Hello. Good evening. What a fantastic and full room. It's so great to see you all this evening. And on Margaret Thatcher's 100th birthday. How wonderful. So...
I'm so sorry, Reem.
Yes.
I'm going to have to interrupt you because we haven't taken the pre-vote.
Oh.
That was entirely my error. Someone just messaged me. Let's do the pre-vote. Stay right where you are. Thatcherism was good for Britain is the motion. And you can choose agree, disagree, or undecided. I should say that the measure of success this evening is not an absolute victory in this poll. It is whether you have moved the needle in each direction. So we will take the same poll at the end, and I suppose it is inevitable that those people who chose to come on a cold autumnal day to talk about Margaret Thatcher will tend to be in the supportive camp. We shall see whether they are more or less numerous at the end. So with 123 of you having voted, 60.98, so 61% are in favour of the motion that Thatcherism was good for Britain. 17% disagree, and 22% are undecided. With apologies for the interruption,
That's okay.
Reem Ibrahim.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, it's fantastic to see everybody here this evening when we are celebrating and marking 100 years since the birth of Margaret Thatcher. Now, I would like to argue that Thatcherism was a rescue plan for a country in decline. We can't really discuss what Thatcherism was for Britain until we really talk about what it looks like in the 1970s. Now, I wasn't around in the 1970s, but I do recall looking at so many different books and thinking about what it was actually like, and we can transform it. But if you just step out in 2025, you'll have a pretty good idea of what the 1970s was really like. So, the 29th of April 1975, the Wall Street Journal ran an article entitled, "Goodbye, Great Britain." We had rubbish piled high, we had trade unions out of control, we had fundamental decline in this great country. And part of it was the large expansion of the welfare state and the large expansion of the government's control in your lives. Now, from the Institute of Economic Affairs, I'd like to focus a little bit on the economics, but also talk a bit about what this meant for the country as a whole. So, public spending as a proportion of GDP was at 60%. 60% of the economy was the government. That's 40% of the government being the productive, the private sector, where people are able to actually work and be able to make a profit, and 60% of that being taken in taxation and being spent by the state, without your consent, of course. Now, we had the standard income tax rate at 52%. The highest top rate of income tax was at 83%, making Britain one of the most uncompetitive countries in Europe. We also had the slowest economic growth in all of Europe, and yet in the 1980s, we managed to get to be the fastest in Europe, bar Spain, who started in a much worse position than we did. So we had a 3-day week, we had strikes, we had bins piling high, we had huge amounts of despair. And then came 1979, where it had all just gotten to effectively a breaking point, the winter of discontent, in which thousands of people across the country really realized what was going on and began to discover that it was actually the government's fundamental fault. So, we come to the 1980s, where Margaret Thatcher has spent some time in office, and what did she do? How did she turn Britain down this road to serfdom into a path to prosperity? Well, she did so by fundamentally understanding that the size of the state was far too big, and that that productive part of the economy is where you are actually able to get wealth. A country becomes prosperous not by the government, but by businesses, by individuals, by every single person in the country being able to work and create value. And she spoke about this in the terms popular capitalism. And I think that this is really, really quite fantastic, because effectively what she was saying is the free market, voluntary exchange in which every single one of us in the country is able to make the decision about where our own money goes without some government bureaucrat telling us to. So, I want to talk a little bit about the telecommunications as one example of where privatization, the mass selling off of the state, actually really worked. It was illegal to connect privately made telephones to state monopolies until 1982, which, as a Gen Zer with my iPhone, is absolutely shocking to me. The push button and the cordless made it de facto illegal, and the state underinvested in those exchanges, meaning that it didn't have those modern equipment for dialing. So privatization meant that you had that innovation, you had that technological advancement, and fundamentally people were actually able to invest in those companies should they choose to. It became a normal thing for everyday people to buy shares, and actually what that meant is people could have a stake in society. We also saw the size of the state, the sort of public spending as a proportion of GDP, go down to about 30% by the end of the 1980s. Again, meaning that people actually were able to keep more of what they earned. Taxation was able to be reduced. Public spending overall didn't go down that much, actually, when you think about it over the 11 years. But what did happen is that we actually saw economic growth. Economic growth. That word is often used quite frequently in 2025, and yet it seems as though no politician knows how to actually achieve it. So I've spoken at length about the economy and how she turned things around, but I also want to talk about what that meant for Britain on the global stage. I've been to the Falkland Islands. I went earlier this year, and I cannot emphasise enough what that meant for the Falkland Islanders, who are, by the way, I think, understand Britain more than we do in some respect. And what that meant is it was a symbol for what Great Britain really was. Whilst we were in decline in the 1970s and Argentina thought they could get away with taking over what was rightfully ours, Thatcher, as Prime Minister, was able to turn things around and really return to what Britain really was, which is a great, great country.
Reem Ibrahim, thank you so much. I am going to be quite militant about the 5-minute rule. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Suzanne Moore.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I've got Peter on my side, so I imagine he's going to do a hardline Marxist deconstruction of the Thatcher era. Although he won't tell me what he's doing, because that's where team spirit is at this point. So I'm just going to give you the soft left perspective, but there was nothing soft about that era. Thatcher may have pumped extra air into the ice cream to make it cheaper and more fluffy, but there was nothing about Thatcher that was not hard-edged and hard-nosed. This was a brutal and destructive and immensely cruel time. Thatcher was very dark. So my reaction to her, as you can see, like many people from my generation, is visceral. I think we still live with the damage that she did to this country. What do I mean by Thatcherism? Well, she didn't invent it, Keith Joseph did. And when I worked at Marxism Today, people like Stuart Hall started to talk about the theory of it. And that we could understand that times have changed. Subculturally, we could see that we were in a post-Fordist economy, and that clothes, advertising, music was reflecting a need for aspiration. So, as Reem said, there was a stagnation in the 70s. The unions had become powerful. There was post-imperial decline. And here was Thatcher, all va-va-voom, especially when she lowered her voice. And she would come and she would ignite the Big Bang. She would make the City of London the finance centre. She would sell off all our national assets. She would devastate the unions. She would deregulate the markets. And the markets became not popular capitalism, but a religion. So Thatcherism was a mix of petty bourgeois ideology. The market was good, elitism was good, individualism was good, the state was bad, law and order was good, patriotism was good, trade unions were bad, permissiveness was bad, women's liberation was bad. So we have a right-wing laissez-faire economic strategy with a reactionary authoritarian populism. Sound familiar? What did this mean? It meant that many of us on the left did not understand this at first, because she was transgressive. She was the wrong sex and class, and I will give her that. And she had an instinctive grasp of politics. She was one of our first feelings, not facts leaders. What she said, economics are the method, the object is to change the heart and soul. But how did she do that? She changed and she destroyed any sense of our collective capacity, and she replaced it with a lot of nasty selfishness. Individualism was celebrated, loads of money, the fantasy of wealth trickling down did not happen. The rich got rich, the poor got poorer. When I came home in 1981 from hitching around Europe, I saw homeless people sleeping on the street for the first time in London because she had removed the benefits of a generation. I'm not going to go with the whole Elvis Costello tramp the dirt down thing. It's not my thing. I much prefer the Adrian Moles poem, "Do you weep like a sad willow on your Marks and Spencer's pillow?" That's what he wrote down. The lasting damage is there. The miners' strike was this country's last civil war, and I will never forget it. It was about breaking up whole communities. We still import coal, obviously. The police were bussed all over the country to break up the heads of working men. Was that a small estate? I don't think so. When I went up and interviewed these people, the miners, they described themselves as retired undefeated. But loss was everywhere. Deindustrialization did not mean that more jobs came in. It meant that heroin came in. It meant expensive stereo shops came in for their redundancy payments. So she deindustrialised in the name of financialisation, and these were the left behinds. She bribed many by letting people buy their council houses, but she didn't build any more, and this is part of the housing crisis that we still live with today. She sold off British Gas, remember Tell Sid? She basically asset stripped the country. She sold privatisation as liberation, but it was division. And a discourse of deserving and undeserving poor and Victorian values came into play. Having voted for the decriminalisation of homosexuality, she brought in the dreadful Section 28. She pulled up the ladder for women behind her. She did not put down the ladder. She promoted just one as a junior minister. She was the exception that proved the rule. There was a lot of Freudian speculation about her handbag. Just what did she keep in that purse? She was able to conjure chaos and threat in her peripheral vision, our peripheral vision. The enemy was suddenly the Falklands. None of us have ever heard of the Falklands before that. The enemy was the miners with the Yorkshire Stalin of Arthur Scargill. The only thing that she did was good. She produced a fine oppositional culture in the 80s, with the exception of Billy Bragg. Her greatest achievement, she once said, was Tony Blair. What she did was break the post-war consensus, but she broke much more. She was a zealot.
30 seconds.
Thatcherism was not about deindustrialisation, it was a form of demoralisation. This country lost the idea that the working man or the working woman could ever really win again. But who am I to argue with a great man like Peter Mandelson, or with his judgment? He said, in 2002, we are all Thatcherites. I say, no, some of us aren't, because we haven't had our hearts and soul ripped out. Thatcherism was not good for Britain.
Suzanne Moore, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, this is fun.
And now, with a total time to prepare of 12 minutes, Michael Gove.
Woo!
Thatcherism works. Half an hour ago, I was literally unemployed. Now, I have been put to useful work. Half an hour ago, those who are ready to talk this country down were in a majority. Now, we're fighting back. Half an hour ago, one inspirational lady in blue was prepared to stand up for free markets. Now, the tide has turned. Thatcherism is back and it's winning. It was Winston Churchill who said that the greatest virtue in politics, without which all other virtues are meaningless, is courage. And I want to salute the opposition's courage this evening, because both Suzanne and Peter were Marxists in their youth. Peter famously, notoriously you might say, was a Trotskyist when he was a young man. Suzanne, of course, was one of the many brilliant writers who grace the pages of Marxism today. But now they find themselves in conservative circles and in the pages of conservative newspapers. Why? Because the facts of life are conservative. And no one embodied those facts of life or political courage more than Margaret Thatcher. Over the summer, I took Reem's advice, and I read about the 1970s. I read a brilliant book by the historian Dominic Sandbrook, one of the co-presenters of The Rest is History. It's a book called Seasons in the Sun. It describes Britain in the 1970s, and the situation was so dark, literally dark, because of the 3-day week and the strikes that afflicted our energy supplies, that this country was deemed to be ungovernable. On the right, threats of coups. On the left, trade unions who were insisting on wage demands that inflation ran at above 20%. That meant that for those who saved and for those who strove, their hard work was literally taken from them every day by an economy that no longer worked for working people and by a system that was betraying our democratic traditions. It was Margaret Thatcher who in 1979 set that process in reverse. Yes, tough decisions had to be taken, but unless those decisions had been taken, then Britain would have been in decline. As Reem pointed out, in 1975, our friends in the United States thought that Britain was gone forever. But it was thanks to Margaret Thatcher and what she achieved in her 11 years in power that we were able, alongside the United States, to show that free markets, free enterprise, and free speech could revitalize any nation. And we also stood for freedom against its most indomitable foe, Soviet communism, and saw that communism defeated. Now, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, in fact, even before that, she was derided as shrill, irrelevant, someone who traded in housewife economics. She told the country, you simply cannot spend what you have not earned. 364 economists, the experts of their day, wrote to the Times denouncing her budget in 1981, saying that it would be ruinous. But she stayed the course. The lady was not for turning. The basic housewife economics that she enunciated actually ensured that Britain was restored to economic health, that we saw re-employment, we saw the growth of which Reem spoke, and that growth wasn't restricted to a narrow and selfish few. I was in Liverpool just 2 weeks ago for the Labour Party conference. Visit the Albert Docks, visit that miracle of urban regeneration, go to Canary Wharf, see the ground that was once left, muddied, broken, and completely bereft of hope. And in both of those areas which never voted and probably will never vote Conservative, you saw what free enterprise and a government committed to ensuring that Britain stands tall on the world stage could achieve. And she never stood taller, as Reem reminded us, than when fascism attempted to ensure that British subjects and British citizens were oppressed by a regime for which they had not voted and which did not have their best interests in heart. The war in the Falklands in 1982 was an attempt by a literal fascist dictator to not just erode British sovereignty, but to say to the West, you're slack, you're weak, you cannot stand up for the democracy that you seek to proclaim. And Margaret Thatcher, notwithstanding the temporizing of our erstwhile European allies, notwithstanding even the lukewarm support that she received from the United States, sent a task force in order to ensure that democracy would prevail. A country that since Suez had regarded itself as continually in retreat was at last able to roll back not just the frontiers of the state at home, but the frontiers of tyranny abroad. And that victory laid the groundwork for the victory in 1989 and 1990 that saw the Berlin Wall fall, millions liberated, and Margaret Thatcher vindicated. That is why Thatcherism succeeded. That is why Britain should be proud of the lady. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Really good.
To follow that and to set out the second case for the opposition, Peter Hitchens.
Good evening. What do you mean by good? And leaving aside the fact that during my researches for this evening I discovered that Margaret Thatcher was an enthusiast for drinking skimmed milk, much of what you believe, and indeed of what Michael believes about the Iron Lady, is fantasy. If only I had a Victorian thing called an epidioscope, I could here project to you this picture of Mrs. Thatcher during the 1975 Common Market referendum wearing a jumper with the flags of all the Common Market countries urging the nation to stay in the European Union. Or I could drag up for you the 1961 speech to her constituency, lasting 2 hours, a Fidel Castro event in which she explained to her constituents that's what she wanted the country to join and why, and understood wholly at the time the key issue of sovereignty. You might also look at the fact that when she was Education Secretary under Edward Heath, she did nothing. I mean, 2 parts of damn all. Thank you so much. If anybody couldn't hear me already, you can now hear me twice. 2 parts of damn all, let's be specific about it, to reverse the destruction of the state grammar schools, which were at the time the only way in which the children of the poor could get a good education. Now, there is no way in which the children of the poor in this country can get a good education. She was Education Secretary in a Conservative government, and she did nothing about it. We've had the Falklands raised. Now, I come from a naval family. My father was familiar with the Falkland Islands in the 1930s. I was one of the few people in the country who knew where they were when they were attacked. What I also know is that in the years immediately before the fascist regime of General Galtieri in Argentina began to plan to seize the Falklands, Margaret Thatcher and her chosen Defense Secretary, John Nott, were busily getting rid of the Navy. And if they'd had another couple of years, they would have sold or scrapped the Invincible and the Hermes, the two crucial ships in the task force for recapturing the Falklands. The Falklands, ladies and gentlemen, were recaptured by the Royal Navy, which Margaret Thatcher had tried to sink, not by Margaret Thatcher. And once you're clear of that myth, you can then look again at her amazing economic policy. I also spent many of those years as a Labour correspondent, and I watched the great industrial Ragnaroks, time after time, unions hurling themselves over the top and being mown down in hopeless strikes. Well, of course it is true that if you look at Britain now, it's very, very rare to see a strike by industrial workers. But do you know why this is? Is this because Margaret Thatcher came up with an immensely clever formula to stop people from going on strike? It's because all those industries in which people used to go on strike no longer exist. There is no, and the economy, we're told, the public sector was greatly reduced. We got rid of a steel industry and a coal industry. Now we have great legions of condom outreach workers and local government, I don't know what's, filling up the public sector to just the same extent. What is this good? What is this victory? And how is the country more conservative? What single socially or morally or politically conservative action did Margaret Thatcher ever take during her entire time in office? Not one. I have to say, I'd spent some time, I used to travel with her as a lowly political reporter on her less important foreign trips, so I came into contact with her. I hugely resented the attitude of the left towards her because they loathed her because she was lower middle class and because she was a woman. And it was snobbery and it was anti-feminism that kept them going. These people who claimed to be so fantastically politically liberal and enlightened, they hated her for the worst possible reasons. I admired enormously her rise from the total ordinariness of the corner shop at Grantham to being Prime Minister. It was an admirable thing. No one can look at her personal career and not think this was somebody of enormous distinction. I don't deny any of that. But in terms of politics, in terms of economics, she was, if the Falklands had not come along and if Admiral Leach had not rescued her from her own folly, she was on the verge of collapse. The alliance, the Social Democrat and Liberal Alliance at the time was sweeping her away, during which time, I have to tell you, she got together with the General Secretary of the Labour Party and abandoned plans which would actually have greatly undermined and probably destroyed Labour fundraising, so saving the country for Tony Blair. This is the great Iron Lady, the woman who saved Britain for conservatism, except that she didn't. It's all a great wobbling blancmange of myth. None of it is true. Admirable person, useless politician. At the end of it, the country fantastically worse off than it was before. Privatization? Are you enjoying Thames Water? Was it really so good? I have to tell you, it's a hugely overrated thing. I myself would renationalize the railways properly, not half-heartedly as it's being done at the moment, tomorrow, though that wasn't her, that was John Major, the man she mistakenly created. Again, another sign of her lack of political nous. I'm sorry, this person is hugely, enormously overstated, overrated, and overpraised. In fact, it amounts to something like Thatcher-olatry. The time has come to end it. If you're a liberal, if you're a Blairite, I can even see why Suzanne might be in favour of her, but I cannot see why any conservative could ever be in favour of Margaret Thatcher or would defend her political memory. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well done, Peter.
We are now going to go in the same order through our debaters and give them a much shorter period of time just to respond, and you don't even need to stand up at the podium for this, respond to any thoughts or things that you've heard that you feel need addressing. So we'll start with you, Reem.
Okay. Thank you. So I just want to address the Thames Water privatisation point. Privatisation works when individuals, consumers, are able to have choice and there is competition between those firms. In water, we have had none of that. What the government did was they sold off organisations like Thames Water, whilst Ofwat, the government regulator, regulated absolutely every single thing that company did. And so because that company was moulded to the regulations of the state, there is no competition. So yes, Peter is right, that was a failure, but it wasn't a failure of competition, it was a failure of government regulation. The other point I just want to add about
point of information, who designed that regulation?
the government.
Exactly.
Yes, well, I would absolutely like the government to be smaller, and I would absolutely like the government to have less of its tentacles into the private sector. However, to say that Thames Water's failures are a failure of privatisation is fundamentally untrue. It is a failure of government overreach.
Okay, Reem, thank you for that. Suzanne, what that you've heard from the other speakers has most upset, enraged, or indeed enthralled you?
You're talking about privatisation being good. I'm interested in the privatisation of morality that went on culturally. So, for instance, I don't know if you remember Cecil Parkinson, who impregnated his secretary, and loads of those guys did all that stuff. At the same time, there was a real going on about single parents and trying to deprive people of benefit and all of that stuff. So I think she was part of the kind of general privatisation of morality. I would say in some ways very unchristian. I mean, one of her famous things about the Good Samaritan was that she said you could only have a Good Samaritan because he had money. So that was the way that you saw, the way that she saw everything. And I think that this was a sort of terrible thing to teach a generation of people that the only thing that mattered, it was like the price of everything, the value
Point
of
of
nothing.
information, if I may. I would like to challenge this idea that morality was somehow privatised. I'd probably argue that morality has always been a private matter. Morality comes from the individual, and so I'd like to ask what changed between the 1960s, the 1970s, and when Thatcher came in 1979? What changed that made morality somehow private, but it was previously a state matter?
Because it just was about what you could pay for. But the other thing I wanted to say was one of the things that interested me is Peter's weird obsession with skimmed milk. What is wrong with skimmed milk, Peter?
I think we'll come to that.
Milk.
What is wrong with skimmed milk? It's bad for you.
So the first thing to say is that Peter makes a very powerful point about semi-skimmed milk. I completely agree with him. Gold top is my favourite.
Is it skimmed or semi-skimmed? What are we?
No. Either.
Whole milk.
Full fat milk is the only way to go.
Full-fat.
However, full
Unfortunate.
fat Thatcherism made the difference to this country. So Peter makes the point about Margaret Thatcher's early support for the European Union, or the common market as it then was. But she was the person who was visionary enough in her Bruges speech after the Single European Act to say that the development of the EU was such that we could no longer remain members. And I think that her view broadly reflected the majority in the country, which was that a trading arrangement with our close neighbours was a good thing, but a superstate, a bad one. And it was that capacity to be pragmatic, rooted in her training as a scientist, allied to her native patriotism, that also meant that on the environment, she was visionary. She was the person who, alone among world leaders, first rang the alarm bells on climate change and on nature depletion, oft forgotten, but important to stress, that she was someone who always looked at the bigger picture. And looking at the bigger picture when it comes to privatisation. Yes, of course, Thames Water has let us down, but at the time that Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, it was the case that the government even owned pubs in Carlisle. The reach of the state was so extensive that it needed to be pruned back, and that was the only way in which we ensured that we actually had a competitive economy. And Peter makes the point, of course, that our industry has, relative to 1979, has fewer people, our industries have relatively fewer people working in them. But overall, the rate of employment has risen, and more particularly, the number of strikes and the crippling ability of trade unions to hold the country to ransom has gone. And that's because of the trade union legislation, and in particular, her defeat of Arthur Scargill, someone who was receiving money directly from Moscow in order to overturn the democratically elected prime minister of that time. So of course we can lament some of the economic changes that globalization has wrought. But let's not for a moment take anything away from the achievements of someone who at every point believed in this country's innate greatness and was determined to ensure that the British people would get the change they voted for.
Thank you, Michael. Peter Hitchens.
Yeah. Couple of things. Somebody mentioned Christianity. Margaret Thatcher in 1968 was among those Conservative MPs who opposed one of the biggest social changes this country has undergone in the past century, the Divorce Law Reform Act, which actually created, in effect, no-fault divorce in this country, and has been a great delight for many adults and an absolute misery for millions of children who've lived with the consequences of it. She didn't like it, but she did nothing, again, when she was in office, either between 1970 and 1974, or when she was Prime Minister, to do anything at all to moderate that piece of legislation. The other things, Michael mentioned the pubs in Carlisle. It is true that vestigially the government did own some pubs in Carlisle. I think around about that time it also owned a rather fine restaurant in the basement of the Tate Gallery. These were not crucial to the issue of state control versus privatization. They were a hangover of what I believe to have been a very noble effort in this country to control the appalling levels of drinking, which was so socially destructive, and in which Lloyd George took advantage of the First World War to control by legislation which included nationalisation of the pubs in Carlisle, but also actually led to much, much, much less drinking, much, much, much less domestic violence, and an enormous social change for the better, which the Thatcher government in the 1980s dismantled, not as a result of any kind of popular will, presumably because it was being lobbied by the kind of people who want to sell more booze. On Saturday night, I was stranded in the fine city of Reading, home of an excellent copy of the Bayeux Tapestry. I was stranded there thanks to the privatised railway company, which had decided that the train I was going on would go somewhere else, so I couldn't go there. And I walked around the centre of Reading on Saturday evening about 9 o'clock, and every single pub had at least 2 very large bouncers at the door. The amount of violence and unhappiness and distress created by that stupid, unconservative piece of action should never be forgotten, nor should be her attack on the Sunday trading laws, which protected many, many families and many, many individuals from being forced to work on Sundays, which they now, in many cases, have to do. That was another of her conservative actions. She was not a conservative. Yes, she had achievements beyond doubt, but they weren't conservative achievements, and they weren't good achievements. They didn't make the country better than it was before she started.
What is a conservative?
The preservation of the good and the trusted, the opposition to unnecessary and foolish change, fundamental principles of conservatism, which she did in no case follow.
So there you have it, Thatcher, not conservative enough for
Not conservative at all.
Not conservative at all. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to invite you in to this debate now. If we can have a little bit more light, we're going to take questions from you, if you have them. Please raise your hand and someone will come round with a microphone. There's a gentleman here about halfway up on the left who has his hand up. And then there's a lady 2 in front of him. Well, let's start with those. We will try and get all the way around the room.
I guess my question is for Peter. If we drop the nomenclature of conservatism and we say that Thatcherism is an unusual form of conservatism, it doesn't dispute the point of this debate, which is that she was good for Britain.
Okay, fair enough. Good point. We'll see what he has to say about that. And the lady just 2 in front of you.
Why, notwithstanding Margaret Thatcher, we are back to the 1970s? Why, notwithstanding we had her, it appeared that we can't escape a declining historical cycle? So
if Thatcher was so great, why are we back to a story of decline? Why does it feel like the 1970s today? To conclude this batch, this gentleman on the front row.
The ending of the Cold War, Reagan, Thatcher sidekick. Important contribution or window dressing?
Important contribution or window dressing, the end of the Cold War. Let's start with this side. Peter, there was one question directed at you. Do you want to have a chance to answer that?
I thought the most striking of those questions was why are we still mired in national decline, despite all this trumpeting of supposed recovery? And the fundamental reason is this, is that nobody in this country is willing to accept that we are no longer a great power and that we are no longer rich. We are, even so, an extremely fortunate country with beautiful territory on which to live and a highly educated population and huge legacies which we could make enormous use of. But we persist in believing that we are still some sort of great power, madly trying to maintain a nuclear deterrent which falls into the sea when we try to fire it, madly pretending that we're a great power which can intervene in wars all over the world when we can't and can't afford it when we're borrowing money to pay interest on our own debts. It's only when the country has a leader who is prepared to recognize the true state of this nation, its finances, its education, its culture, its society, its infrastructure, that we will recover. She never did that because she wasn't a conservative and she wasn't interested, and she was interested only in following various illusions and ideologies. That is always a failure.
Suzanne.
Just quickly on that, I think it's very interesting that we seem to be in the conditions that created her again, and I get that. But I think one of the problems for the right, which exists still, is that she is still haunting you. You will not let her go, and you need to let her go.
Either Michael or Reem, whoever prefers, you can take any of those three questions to respond to.
Why is Britain in decline? Well, public spending as a proportion of GDP is at 44%. We are currently paying the highest tax burden since World War II. We had higher taxes under the last Conservative government than we did under the Labour governments of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. So when we're thinking about all of this in totality, I think we would be quite right to think about what the radicalism of Margaret Thatcher could look like in 2025. And to Peter's point about Thatcher not being a conservative, perhaps she didn't conserve the socialist decline that we saw in the 1970s. And I say that's quite a good thing. I don't think she was a conservative in that sense. She was a radical. She radically changed Britain for the better. And quite frankly, I wish we had a politician with the convictions she had in 2025.
Okay, we're going to take some more questions now. There's a gentleman just at the front here with his hand up.
So I was reading this little-known outlet called UnHerd, and you might have heard of it somewhere. And it said by 1994, just after she was done, the number of quangos we had in this country was estimated to be around 5,000. In addition, she continued with state education, expanded it. She expanded the universities, which was the genesis of woke. She took away our guns, which are our right to hold as Englishmen. She perpetuated the vile race relation laws, maintained fiat currency over gold, backed the EU having control over our laws in this country, so sold us out, which hasn't really been done since the Act of Supremacy, and didn't stem the tide of mass migration, which Mr. Power warned us about. Did she simply not take us out of the frying pan of an economic shock and into the inferno of a managerialist, socialist state?
There's some applause for that. Let's go to the back of the room, where we haven't had too much.
So a quick question to Peter and Suzanne. The debate is about this House believes Thatcherism was good for Britain, and you suggest that it wasn't. My question would be, what would be the alternative?
Okay, that's an interesting one. Let's take one final question. Is there anyone over there, Alice, near you on this side of the room that we can take? We want to make sure we're travelling around.
The previous gentleman actually stole my question. I mean, perhaps to expand on it then, in 1979, what is the actual realistic alternative? Mr. Hitchens, Ms. Moore, what would your realistic alternative be?
Okay, well, I think that's an interesting challenge to the opposition. People saying, if not Thatcherism, then what? Suzanne, do you want to take that?
Well, I would have preferred not all-out class war myself. What she was able to do, and I agree with Reem, she was radical, and she was a radical person. But I think that the destruction of a civic sphere, of the collective, is ultimately a very damaging thing for society. Now, I'm not preaching Marxism here today, and I wasn't actually a Marxist, but never mind. The alternative in 1979 was, for some people it was managed decline, but it did not have to be the absolute attack on working people. She did not have to, when Thatcher came in, we were building 100,000 council houses a year. It went down to 9,000. These very basic things in life, social housing, society, when she said, the famous quote, there is no such thing as society, this every man for himself, this kind of ideology, I think has ultimately been very damaging. Now, if you're asking me whether a Labour government would have done so much better, I can't answer that. But this extreme right-wing ideology, if something moves, you privatise it, you ask how much it's worth, and you make people feel like shit if they don't have money, was not the way forward for me.
Michael? One of the questioners was accusing Thatcher of having set us up for managerialism and a socialist quagmire.
There are many people who could probably be accused of that, and I might be one of them, but you certainly couldn't accuse Margaret Thatcher of that. I think it's sometimes a mistake to attribute to politicians, even the most talented and transformational, the ability to stand athwart history and say stop to every trend at every time. Part of the art of politics is recognizing where the real problems lie. Margaret Thatcher herself inherited a Conservative Party where she was viewed by many as a vulgar interloper whose desire to reduce the size and scope of the state and also to support what were known as Victorian values were hideously reactionary. But she knew that what she needed to do was to concentrate on the principal areas of weakness in the country. That's why she concentrated her allies, initially, people like Geoffrey Howe and, as it happens, John Nott and Nigel Lawson, in the economic ministries. Because unless there'd been an economic transformation in this country, unless the relentless growth of state spending and state control were tackled, then nothing else would have been possible.
May I have a point of information here? Do you believe that the destruction of manufacturing employment in this country during the Thatcher government was an intentional action or a blunder?
I don't believe that it was an intentional destruction, not at all. Margaret Thatcher wanted to ensure that Britain's manufacturing sector, like every part of the economy, flourished, if possible, without state subsidy. State subsidy only perpetuates inefficiency. And actually, the energy which she showed, for example, in supporting British aerospace, the energy in which she showed in supporting transformational figures like Arnold Weinstock and John King and so on, showed that she was not just happy in the presence of industrialists, but fated by them. Sorry,
my point is this. When I was growing up in this country, everything we used was made here. The cars that my parents drove were made in this country. The bicycles I rode were made in this country. The cooking pots and pans we used in the kitchen, the cookers, all the equipment in the house were made in this country. Everything we used, the tools in the tool shed, absolutely everything. Now nothing is. Nothing. You can't find, except in immense luxury goods, you can't find things. I haven't finished.
We are better off.
You can't find things which are made here, and a large part of that follows the strategy of the Thatcher government. Now, what I wanted to know from Michael was whether he thinks Margaret Thatcher and her cabinet intended to destroy British manufacturing industry and employment, or whether it was an accident. Whichever the answer is, it doesn't seem to me to be good.
Peter, effectively what you're arguing against here is the fact that free trade and importing things from other countries that are made more efficiently is a bad thing in itself. And I just think that is a really, really important idea to really challenge. Other countries may make things in a more efficient and cheaper way. That is a good thing for British consumers. It means that Brits are able to have cheaper goods that are made more efficiently in other countries. Now, we may choose to buy British. That should be a choice. British taxpayers should not be forced to foot the bill for lame duck industries that are uneconomical. That is why manufacturing declined, not because she said she wanted them to decline, but because she refused to force British taxpayers to pay for it.
Okay, I just wanted to add 2 words to support Reem and also to challenge Peter, and those words are Robin reliant.
Let's take some of these questions at the front now. There's a gentleman in the blue jumper here. We'll start with him.
Thank you. Behind you on the screen, it says Thatcherism. And it strikes me that there's a dichotomy, which I don't think anyone's really delved into quite yet, which is about what Margaret Thatcher did when she was in power, what she thought and what she did, and what is now being looked back on in hindsight as Thatcherism. And there is a difference. Can we try and separate those two?
The most telling thing Thatcher ever said about her legacy was to say that her greatest creation was New Labour. If we couldn't accuse her of being a managerialist technocrat, we may be able to accuse them. And I wonder, I'd ask anyone in the audience, maybe particularly Michael or Peter, how Thatcher may have enabled Blairism.
Sir?
I think to Lord Gove's point about the practicalities of a politician in Margaret Thatcher's position in terms of taking choices of what's possible. I believe it's true that she had the decision to make as to whether to go for the miners or the teaching profession. And I just wonder whether you felt she made the right decision.
Well, since that's directed at Lord Gove, do you want to take that?
I'm not sure that the choice was hers. I think it was forced on her by the decision that Arthur Scargill made to go for a strike without a ballot. And it was certainly the case that not just Margaret Thatcher, but many in the Conservative Party had an appreciation and an affection for the solidarity that had been expressed in times of war in particular by those who worked in our mines. So it wasn't a battle of choice, it was a battle that was forced on her. And the critical thing I think then about it, as I mentioned earlier, is that Arthur Scargill wasn't simply a trade unionist in the tradition of others who'd stood up for those who paid their dues. He was someone who was an active Marxist. I know it sounds antique to say that, but literally true, who was supported by Soviet Russia, financially and morally. And that relates to the point about, the previous point about Thatcherism and Margaret Thatcher. Of course, a myth or myths have grown up about Margaret Thatcher and about the 1980s, some of which are attempts by people on the right to body stature, as it were, for whatever they may happen to believe at the moment. Others are attempts to try to suggest that everything that was achieved in the 1980s was somehow part of a corrupt stripping away of everything that was noble and wise and right about Britain. I think it is important to judge her properly in her context, and there was a body of thought that she helped to generate, and that body of thought, I think, was a proper Conservative response to decline. She was the right woman at the right time for a country that needed a bracing stripping back of the state and a reassertion of national purpose.
Peter, I'm going to just throw one at you, if I may, because I wrote down some of the questions from earlier. This question of the Cold War, this is something you've thought about a lot and written about.
I was in the Cold War.
This is something that I think you have to deal with if you're an opponent of Thatcherism. Was the questioner right that she should take a good deal of credit for having won it?
Well, no. The Cold War was won by the United States, and our role in the end of it is pretty limited. And it was also won by the Soviet Union destroying itself with crazy economic policies, not dissimilar to the kind we're pursuing here now, and therefore collapsing in on itself. During the time when I was a political reporter and following her around, I used to admire her for her refusal to swallow what was then the standard left-wing academic line, was that it was wicked of the Western countries to stand up as fiercely as they did to the Soviet Union. And particularly there was the 1980s campaign by the left in this country to prevent the installation of cruise and Pershing II missiles, in response, I should say, to the stationing of medium-range nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe by the Soviet Union, completely falsely portrayed in a disgraceful way. And in all those things, she was right. But the part which Britain played in that was, I have to say, quite minor. And when you look back on it, as I have, and after it was over, I went to live in the Soviet Union and therefore found out quite a lot more about it. Our role in it was not that great. What she said was right, and like some of the things about it, admirable, but it wasn't crucial to her position, and there were people in the Labour Party in those days who took more or less the same view. I think Jim Callaghan's view of the Cold War was pretty impeccable, for instance, and I just don't think she can claim to have had sole rights to victory in the Cold War.
So some credit, but
as I said, she is an admirable person. And if you met her or studied her life, you'd have to say there was a lot about her which was admirable, but she was not good for the country, and she was not a conservative.
Thanks, Peter. Are there any questions on the sides here? Those people who have had somewhat interrupted view, I want to make sure that you get a chance. There's a gentleman just here with a pink tie.
I was a child of the 80s, and I grew up thinking that Margaret Thatcher was great, and privatisation and free market economies and all those things. And I just recently, maybe like lots of people here, I've just had some misgivings, Chinese owners of British Steel, and I start to look back and I think, God, were all these things quite right? And I'm open-minded to the arguments of the opponents of the motion here, but I feel like I'm getting mixed messages, if I'm honest with you. I feel like Suzanne's telling me that Margaret Thatcher was too conservative, and Peter's telling me she wasn't conservative enough.
She wasn't conservative at all. Can we get this straight?
Well, Peter,
enough. Not
the problem,
conservative
Peter,
at all,
you
in
said,
any way.
you said that we need a leader in this country who's honest with the country's position and failings and all of these kind of things, and I agree with you. But are you making a perfect enemy of the good? Has any leader since the Second World War, certainly since the 1960s, been more honest with this country since she has?
Been more.
Okay, we'll come to that in a moment. There's a lady just here in a green jumper who I think we should hear from.
I just wanted to clarify what really the distinction is between what Margaret Thatcher, with the decisions she made while she was in power versus what was actually implemented after she left. Because I think there's a lot of issues about implementation versus actually the radicalization that was needed for the country at that time.
This is the final question now. There's a gentleman just up the aisle there.
Reem Ibrahim, I was struck by how you answered Peter Hitchens just then when he was making the point about manufacturing. He said we're better off for it. One of the consequences of the decline of manufacturing in the West has been the rise of China and reliance on vastly subsidized state industries in China, a country which seems to me to be very hostile to this one. So are we better off for that?
Good question.
Okay, thank you. Is there, if I could just pick one of those themes for you slightly, is there a communality of critique between the two of you, do you think? One is ostensibly from the left and one from the right, but are you in a way saying the same thing from different angles, in that she was overly focused on markets and left aside those things about society that were in some way sacred?
Peter would just hate to agree with me on anything, so he just isn't going to go there.
That is so not true. I love agreeing with you. I know when I last did there.
No, exactly. I think that what's coming up, though, is the resonance now to the 70s and when she was elected, and this whole question of division and polarisation, which she does represent for me still. And I think some people in the audience, we talk now that, about north-south divides, about the Red Wall, all the things that we're talking about, the rise of reform. It's all there, isn't it? When we look at sort of 79, we can see some of those issues. And the big debate now around immigration, I think it has a lot of roots in the lack of housing, the birth rate dropping, because people can't afford anywhere to live in our cities and so on. So I think that one of the things about looking at Thatcher as a person and looking at Thatcherism and what it delivered, and I agree, these are two different things, because I remember the covers of magazines which were half Madonna and half Thatcher, the material girl. She operates as a figure, and she operates as a very, in our psyche, as a very powerful figure, and it was one of her things that she was able to use to play with her femininity. But I think the ideology of Thatcherism, which has been pretty well understood in some ways by the left more than the right, I have to say, just carried on via Blair, and he was her main achievement. It was, you can never go back. What she did, she was radical, Reem is right, because you could not go back to pre-Thatcher.
I'm going to give you another moment in just a moment.
I just don't want any more polarisation between me and Peter.
Let me just throw it open to the proposition. Two of those questions raised the spectre of China and the idea that there was one gentleman there who said he used to be absolutely immersed in the 80s mood that the free market would solve everything. And is the success of China not a counterexample? And have some of those kind of Thatcherite holy principles not been dented by their success?
Well, Michael sort of alluded to this earlier when it came to British Steel. British Steel, as it was privatised and as it was removed from some of those subsidies, actually became significantly stronger in the 1980s. It was sort of able to restructure, and actually a lot of those uneconomical steel mills were able to close down, and they were actually able to rebuild some really, really quite fantastic British infrastructure. Now, is that the case today? Absolutely not, and you're right. British Steel in the United Kingdom has declined. I would argue partly, sorry Michael, partly as a result of the last government's hugely awful net zero policies that have made this country poorer and made the coking coal extremely difficult and extremely more expensive, and therefore basically hasn't given British industry a chance. Now, would British Steel still exist today had any of those regulations or extremely high taxes or net zero policies been implemented? I don't know, and that's the point of the market, right? And I think I just want to touch on this point very specifically, because Suzanne seems to be arguing that the market is this big scary thing that we have no idea what it is, and it's sort of something quite far removed from reality. The market is all of you. Every single time you make a transaction, every single time you go to work, every single time you build a relationship, you shake somebody's hand, you give somebody eye contact in the street, you see an advert, that is the market, and the market is voluntary. Nobody forces you to buy something. You make that choice. You make the choice to spend your own money every single day. Now, the difference between capitalism and socialism is just that. Socialism is where the government forces you to give up your money and the government decides how it is spent. And fundamentally, I don't believe that that is an ideology of division or polarization. That is an ideology of liberty.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to give, if you want it, if you feel you have said your piece, that is fine. If you want it, you have 1 minute maximum, each of you, to leave the voting public with one thought. What do you want, as they go into the second vote to see whether we have moved the dial, what thought do you want them to take away? Lord Gove.
Think about all the prime ministers who've been alive during the time that you've been alive. Think of all the prime ministers since Winston Churchill. If there was one of them, just one, that you could have running Britain now and dealing with our challenges, who would you choose?
Peter Hitchens, a concluding thought before we go.
I quite fancy another go at Alec Douglas-Hume, actually, but he wasn't given enough of a chance. A lot of experience. The principal point about Margaret Thatcher is that she wasn't a conservative, she was a liberal. And she was liberal in economics, and she was not so much an active liberal in social and moral policy, but she was a permissive liberal in that she allowed the country to be overtaken by the greatest cultural revolution which has overtaken any country really since the one which swept China, which completely transformed this country. The other thing is this: anybody in the New Labour outfit, and somebody else asked me who else was very effective Prime Minister in this country, and I'd say Alistair Campbell, who was Prime Minister for some years, aided by a grinning jackanapes who pretended to be Prime Minister. Well, Alistair did the work. These people knew, and it was an absolute basic belief all the time, and had been in the Labour Party since the 1930s, that the crucial thing that any serious government with real ambition to change the country has to do is to ensure that future governments cannot undo its legacy. Now, the Campbellites were brilliant at that, and they have absolutely locked this country into the transformation which they achieved for the worse. Now, the problem with Margaret Thatcher, if you admire her, as some people persist crazily in doing, is that during her time in office, she did nothing, whatever, to ensure that there would never be an Alistair Campbell government, or that it wouldn't be able to succeed or pass disastrous legislation such as the Equality Act of 2010. Nothing. It was all free. They had a completely free field in which to destroy the country which she was supposed to be protecting.
That's
one
democracy.
of her biggest failures. So yes, indeed.
You're blaming
He isn't just. I love the way they heckle. She wasn't Blair's auntie, or he wasn't her heir, but she created the conditions in which Blairism, that disaster, flourishes even today, and flourished, of course, even more during the government of David Cameron, who was another Blairite, but in this case masqueraded as a Conservative. She made that possible by negligence and by not understanding her opponents.
Reem, a final thought for the audience.
I find it utterly bizarre that Peter is blaming Thatcher, who left office in 1990, for legislation that was enacted in 2010. I mean, I think that's quite ludicrous. Thatcherism fundamentally was about giving people their power back, and that is the beauty of the market. You get to make those choices. If you don't trust the government, I certainly don't trust any government, and if you do not believe that the government should have more power in your own pockets, should have more power over your own lives and what your own life looks like, then Thatcherism was good for Britain because it gave you that power back. And I just think when it comes to economic choice. That is fundamentally what Thatcherism is about. Did Thatcher achieve absolutely everything she wanted to in those 11 years? No, of course she didn't. But Thatcherism was about the long-term power being given back to individuals. And for that reason, I think when it comes to the future of liberty, Thatcherism was unequivocally not just good for Britain, but necessary for our future.
Suzanne, do you have a final thought for us before we go into the vote?
Let her go. Let her go.
Let her go, says Suzanne Moore. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's crunch time. We are going to ask the question, Thatcherism was good for Britain. Do you agree or disagree, or are you still undecided? By way of a reminder, we began this evening with 61% pro, 17% against, and 22% undecided. We are going to give another full minute to make sure that all of the votes of people who want to vote can count. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 59.26% agree and 28% against, which means, ladies and gentlemen, that the opponents of the motion are the victors of this evening's debate. They may not have agreed with each other, but enough of the people in the room agreed with at least one of them to change their mind. So we went from 61% pro to 59%. Those people who were disagreeing went from 17% all the way up to 28%. And those undecided have been halved. There are still a 12% of you who can't make your mind up still. In any case, thank you all for coming this evening to this special UnHerd debate. And please join me in thanking our spectacular debaters, Michael Gove, Reem Ibrahim, Suzanne Moore, and Peter Hitchens.